Survival in the rubble of the Gaza Strip, it was already a matter of sheer luck long before the summer of 2025. Under constant Israeli air bombardment, caught in the crossfire between Hamas and the IDF, living in conditions where medicine and shelter are scarce, and where some areas flicker in and out of famine conditions, there are no guarantees that a person living in Gaza today will be able to see tomorrow. The situation is dire all across the territory, and the outlook for the future is exceptionally bleak. But now, even the decision to stand in line and await aid deliveries could be a fatal mistake. Ever since a new aid organization took over, the US-based Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, mass killings at distribution sites have become incredibly common. At last count, over 1,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed while approaching or standing in line to receive life-saving food supplies, and over 5,000 more have been injured. Common denominator, at least thus far, is the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF, whose distribution sites were the place where roughly 7 out of every 10 of those Gazans were killed or wounded. It is a terrifying situation for the civilians caught in the crossfire, who are already trying to navigate one of the most dangerous places on Earth, and as we'll see over the course of today's episode, the situation may only be growing worse. Alright, just before we get into today's episode, we would like to take a moment to discuss how we are going to approach the issue today with 2 key caveats that we have to explain right off the top here. First of all, we are well aware of the extreme sensitivity of conversations around what's happening in Gaza, and we want to be extremely clear. We do not support, endorse, excuse, or seek to justify the behavior of any armed faction in this conflict. We will discuss each of them with nuance, because that is the most effective way to understand their motivations and actions. We'll also be keeping our coverage in each episode focused on the subject at hand, and we will not be watering down or minimizing the atrocities committed by one group by taking detours into the atrocities committed by their adversaries when they aren't pertinent to the focus of the episode. There are plenty of sources out there that will couch critiques of Israel through whataboutism focusing on Hamas, or couch critiques of Hamas through whataboutism focusing on Israel. If you're interested in that sort of coverage, well, you can go elsewhere. And for our second caveat, you'll notice throughout the episode that there are certain keywords that we may avoid using, or certain ways of framing this conflict that we decline to draw upon. This is an intentional choice. When publishing on a platform like this, we and every other creator, we have to navigate content policies that will often restrict the reach of an episode or restrict the earning ability of small outlets like ourselves. Every creator on this platform, including ourselves, we have to find a balance that we believe is best, and we certainly don't claim that ours is the only approach or anything. But given that our highest priority here on WarFronts is to present as reliable, objective, and well-contextualized information as we can, we've chosen to prioritize preserving the reach of these episodes as much as we can, even though at times that means we've got to be a little bit mindful of our presentation. We trust the thoughtful consideration of our viewers to make up any gaps that we unfortunately have to leave. And with all of that said, let's dig in. So, ever since the start of the Israel-Hamas war in the wake of the massive terror attack on October the 7th, 2023, the question of food aid distribution has been a very sensitive one on all sides. For the government of Israel, the Israel Defense Forces, or IDF, and their supporters across the globe, sending unrestricted aid into Gaza would be tantamount to feeding and sustaining Hamas itself, allowing the terrorist insurgency to fight more capably and for far longer than they otherwise could. But for the civilian population of Gaza and for concerned parties around the world, food aid is absolutely essential. Before the war began, Gaza was sustained by a constant flow of 500 to 600 trucks of aid and other supplies per day, accounting for the vast majority of the population's need in a place that's notoriously overcrowded with very little food production capacity of its own. Of course, those two positions on the nature of humanitarian aid in Gaza are in direct conflict with one another. As a result, food aid has been the focus of some of the most enduring controversies since the war began. On several occasions, Israel has instituted long, total blockades of incoming aid shipments, cutting off the only source of food for the Palestinian population, and for much of the war, the IDF has limited incoming aid deliveries to just a fraction of Gaza's actual need. According to the United Nations World Food Programme, every single person in Gaza today is facing, quote, acute levels of food insecurity, while 70,000 children need urgent treatment for acute malnutrition. Parts of Gaza have been on the brink of famine for quite some time, and some zones have intermittently slipped in and out of true famine conditions, with just barely enough aid trickling in and just barely enough other bootstrapped solutions being found to prevent the territory from entering a prolonged state of famine based on the available data. Again, drawing from the World Food Programme, nearly 500,000 people in total are facing catastrophic hunger conditions across Gaza, and it's not for a lack of available resources. Quoting from the WFP one more time, more than 116,000 metric tons of food assistance, enough to feed 1 million people for up to 4 months, is ready to be brought into Gaza if the blockade is lifted. Nonetheless, the IDF and the wider Israeli government have continued to stand in the way of aid deliveries, citing the need to keep up pressure on Hamas and its allies and withhold aid as a coercive tool to force Hamas to release its remaining hostages. And this is where the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation enters the picture. Founded in February of 2025 and based in the US state of Delaware, and having additionally been incorporated in Geneva, Switzerland, the GHF is backed by both the Israeli government in Jerusalem and the United States government under Donald Trump. The circumstances behind the GHF's founding remain murky to this day, as do the specifics of the decision-making and key figures behind the scenes who were ultimately responsible for creating it. As such, some of the specifics that we would like to share when introducing the GHF simply are not available in the public domain. What we do know, however, is that it was initially led by American veteran and philanthropist Jake Wood, co-founder of the international disaster response group Team Rubicon. Wood is no longer part of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation for reasons that we will discuss today as well, and it now operates under the guidance of former US aid manager John McCree and American evangelical Christian leader and Trump ally Johnny Moore. Of the GHF's initial funding, we know that an allocation of $30 million was provided by the United States and rushed through the State Department's vetting processes, although it's believed to have had far more than $30 million at its disposal initially. At the time of writing, the GHF receives $140 million a month to sustain its operations, which it attributes mostly to unnamed private donors. According to a New York Times report published in June of this year, the goal of creating a private food distribution program under Israel's direct oversight has been around since at least December 2023. At that time, Israel began outreach and coordination with a number of primarily American partners, many of whom had a background in private security contracting. We should note, for posterity's sake here, that both the program's advocates and high-ranking figures in the US government generally describe the GHF as an American initiative, but outside reporting suggests that it was both an Israeli program in origin and is guided by Israel in the ongoing execution of its stated mission. Once American partners were looped in, the plan for the GHF slowly took shape. Construct an organization that could manage its own distribution of food and critical aid, concentrate that aid at a small number of key distribution points, protect that aid with the help of private security companies, and ensure that Hamas and other armed groups within Gaza could not benefit. From Israel's perspective, each step of the process came with tactical and strategic benefits for its anti-Hamas operations. By concentrating aid in just a few locations, rather than across hundreds of sites in the way that the United Nations and its partners had done, Israel could install monitoring technologies to identify people coming to receive aid, weeding out known members of Hamas or other groups in the process. And not only that, but they could guide and dictate the locations of Gaza's population, most of whom have been permanently displaced from their pre-war communities, and who Israel is working to cordon off into a few small chunks of Gazan territory in order to clear out and depopulate the rest. By ensuring that the organization had a monopoly on aid entering Gaza, Israel could keep food out of the black market and prevent it from being taken by Hamas or otherwise distributed to the group's fighters. At the same time, they could ice out the UN, often accused by Jerusalem of bias against Israel and interference with the Israeli war effort. Finally, by staffing distribution sites with private security and monitoring the surrounding area with the IDF, Israel could, hypothetically speaking, ensure that food distribution remained a safe and secure process, while at the same time weeding out any members of Hamas or other militant groups who showed up. Now, even on that description alone, we'd imagine that you might already see some of the potential pitfalls here, and you would not be alone in raising concerns. As a chorus of international experts pointed out when the plan's details became clear, concentrating aid in so few places would force malnourished Gazans to travel considerable distances while in very poor health, at risk both because of the adverse health effects and because they'd be walking miles through a war zone. If Israel was so concerned about Hamas stealing aid, then certainly frail, defenseless civilians walking all that way with food on their person would be sitting ducks. Constraining aid deliveries to so few points would mean massive crowds, likely chaos, and lines many hours long. And not only that, but the plan sounded a hell of a lot like using humanitarian aid as a weapon of both war and forced displacement. It would starve out an entire civilian population and force them into tightly controlled checkpoints where perceived threats among them could be picked off while simultaneously coercing civilians into southern Gaza and eventually into a small pocket of the territory that Israel otherwise planned to completely and permanently depopulate. Ultimately, although American officials urged the United Nations and other humanitarian groups to cooperate with the GHF and facilitate its distribution plans, the UN, the Red Cross, and other major organizations forcefully condemned the plan, refusing to participate in what they described as an obviously broken, unsafe, and quite likely coercive system. The first aid distributions by the GHF took place on the 26th of May 2025, when a center in Rafah handed out 8,000 boxes of food, enough to feed a bit over 40,000 people for half a week. Within a few weeks, the GHF had opened up a total of 4 distribution points, each of which would open just once a week, often with very limited prior notification to Gazans, ostensibly to ensure that Hamas and other militant groups would not have time to plan attacks. People in need of aid were kept at a considerable distance from sites before they were opened and were forced to travel into what Israel had previously classified as mandatory evacuation zones, in which all of the GHF's distribution points are now located. Under the watch of private security, the GHF's dismal aid deliveries began, and ultimately it took barely 24 hours for the slaughter to begin. In the hours before the GHF began its first aid deliveries in Gaza, there were already signs that something was amiss within the organization. On Sunday, May the 25th, less than a day before operations were set to begin and just 2 days before the killing started, the group's director, Jake Wood, unexpectedly submitted his resignation. As we mentioned earlier, Wood is an experienced leader of humanitarian and philanthropic groups, having provided direct support through one of his organizations in the wake of hundreds of national disasters worldwide. In his resignation, Wood explained that he had been asked to build the GHF to, quote, feed hungry people, address security concerns about diversion, and complement the work of long-standing NGOs in Gaza. But on the eve of the start of GHF operations, Wood explained, quote, it is clear that it is not possible to implement this plan while also strictly adhering to the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, which I will not abandon. That particular description of the GHF situation was damning even by itself, with the implication being that either humanitarian principles could be respected or the GHF could move forward as planned. But those possibilities were mutually exclusive. 2 days later, the worst fears of GHF skeptics would be realized, and not for the last time. On the 27th of May, the GHF began operations at a center in the refugee camp of Tel al-Sultan, under heavy guard from the IDF, as many thousands of Palestinians came to receive aid. Crowd control at the site was nowhere near what was required, and American contractors withdrew from the area surrounding the aid boxes that they'd laid out nearly as soon as distribution efforts had begun. With the aid abandoned, the crowd crushing forward and no mechanism to maintain an orderly process, fear, starvation, and scarcity took over as the crowd surged forward in an attempt to get whatever aid they could. After all, with no coordinated rationing process and no security to protect people who did get their hands on the aid, anybody who couldn't get to the front of the crowd, take what they could carry, and make a quick exit were at risk of either having aid taken from them by other desperate people or just getting nothing at all. Before long, the IDF troops in the surrounding area started letting off gunshots in what they described as a warning for the crowd to keep order. With no clear direction and no easy way to confirm from within the crowd who was firing or why, panic began to spread, although what happened after that is a matter of some dispute. According to eyewitnesses and the Hamas-run Gaza government media office, IDF tanks used their machine guns to fire into the crowd, while other sources suggested that IDF foot soldiers also fired their weapons at civilians. The Gaza Health Ministry, also part of the Hamas-led civil administration in the territory, released a final casualty count of 17 people killed, 86 wounded, and 5 missing, while United Nations officials indicated that most people who had come to medical facilities seeking treatment for their injuries had been wounded by IDF gunfire. Israel denied that it had fired upon the crowd. The killings would come with major implications for the GHF itself, as Boston Consulting Group, previously handling the logistical planning for the foundation, stopped all work on the project 3 days later and withdrew from the effort. Now, if the chaos on the 27th of May had been an isolated incident, then perhaps the IDF's account of the situation might have held some weight. After all, the Gaza Health Ministry is a subordinate of Gaza's Hamas-run government, and although the Gaza Health Ministry's casualty counts are frequently corroborated by outside observers when there's enough available data, the organization has frequently been accused of duplicity by Israel. But with the benefit of hindsight and quite literally dozens of additional insights, well, suffice it to say that claims of only limited IDF intervention have gotten harder and harder to believe. Allegedly. The next incident took place on June the 1st, when at least 32 civilians were killed and over 250 were wounded in a hazy incident in Rafah. According to the Red Cross, which received 21 bodies dead on arrival and 179 other casualties, including women and children, all patients had confirmed that they had been trying to reach a GHF distribution site. The specifics of what happened in the chaos couldn't quickly be established, but most of the wounded bore gunshot or shrapnel wounds and confirmed that IDF soldiers, tanks, and drones had fired upon them, as well as naval warships, according to some eyewitnesses. The GHF denied that anything had happened at all and insisted that aid distribution had taken place, quote, without incident. Multiple members of the global press were able to reach the site shortly afterward and observed dozens of wounded, said an IDF spokesman when asked to account for the incident. We'll quote them here. This week, it was claimed that the IDF fired at civilians in an aid distribution area. This report is entirely false and echoes the propaganda of the terrorist organization Hamas. Regarding the incident on Sunday, it simply didn't happen. 2 days later, another mass casualty event unfolded near a distribution center in Rafah, this time at a location about a kilometer away, as crowds attempted to move toward the center before it was scheduled to open. That opening was supposed to take place at 6 in the morning, and civilians who were close to the front of the pack had greater odds of actually getting supplies for themselves and their families, but there was more to the situation than that. From the hours of 6 at night until 6 in the morning, the distribution point and the surrounding area were designated off-limits to civilians, meaning that by trying to get in line before the site opened, Gazans were technically violating that order. Even though it was after dawn, things were relatively orderly and the site was about to open, as was known to the IDF. Nonetheless, at least 27 people were killed by IDF troops, and the Red Cross reported 184 wounded. The incident would lead the IDF to classify the roads leading up to distribution sites as combat zones. Now, to be clear, in both the killings that we've discussed so far and the ones that we'll talk about next, reports from the ground suggest that on many occasions there have been no clear security threats prior to the IDF and contractors opening fire. We'll discuss one possible reason for that in a few moments, but at least for now, it's important to understand that in most of these cases, soldiers and contractors don't appear to be shooting because some civilian is waving a gun around or because some Hamas cell is trying to stage an attack. According to eyewitness accounts, reports from medical workers, and more recently testimony from some of the soldiers and contractors involved, soldiers are often firing on unarmed crowds without direct provocation. Unfortunately, there were simply too many of these incidents through June and July to give an exhaustive list, but we can at least name some of the most stunning. On June the 10th, 36 people were killed and over 200 wounded across multiple sites, and 26 more people would be killed on the following day by Israeli drones while they waited to access a distribution site. In the following 4 days, at least 70 more people would be killed, and then on June the 17th, Gaza witnessed the worst incident yet. On that date, near Khan Yunis, eyewitnesses reported that Israeli tanks fired multiple shells into a crowd, along with infantry and drone fire, killing nearly 60 in a single incident, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. Later in the month, at least 40 people would be gunned down on July the 24th, and 23 more were killed on the 30th. Over 30 more people died on July the 12th, and over 20 more on July the 16th, after crowds were driven into a stampede by the launch of tear gas. On July the 19th, the IDF reportedly killed over 30 civilians across 2 sites, and then on July the 20th, Gazan officials reported over 90 Palestinians killed in that single day, including over 80 trying to get aid that was coming in through a border crossing. The World Food Programme confirmed that aid workers witnessed crowds being fired upon, and to be clear, there were smaller mass fatality incidents on most of the days that we didn't mention, as, well, there's individual killings that are likely being undercounted due to the chaos that's taken hold. In total, at the time of writing, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has catalogued the deaths of 1,054 Palestinians trying to obtain aid, including 766 killed at or near the GHF's distribution facilities, and most of the others while trying to get aid from United Nations convoys. Those convoys routinely bring food into the territory and stockpile it so that it can be surged to feed the civilian population if Israel were to cede the aid distribution process back to the organizations that know how to do it. The death toll in Gaza so far, exclusively from the incidents tied in some way to the GHF and Israel's new approach to aid distribution, is staggering. And to be clear, we here at WarFronts expect that death toll to rise further even by the time this episode comes out. Just for reference, this episode was recorded on Monday the 28th of July. But it's not enough to just run through a list of specific incidents while failing to acknowledge the much larger pattern that's developing, where this combination of restricted aid, growing crowds of desperate civilians, spiking tensions, and mass casualty confrontations have turned into a deadly and self-perpetuating cycle. More frequent incidents and higher casualties become justification for heightened security, more extensive fortifications, and closer involvement from the IDF, who are supposed to be keeping their distance from the sites. At the same time, the GHF began pulling its personnel back and, for all practical purposes, allegedly turning its distribution sites into killing pens. The results have been devastating, but given the circumstances, there comes a certain point where they should no longer be treated as a surprise. As the Gaza emergency coordinator of Doctors Without Borders explained, quoting them, "The 4 distribution sites, all located in areas under the full control of Israeli forces after people have been forcibly displaced from there, are the size of football fields surrounded by watchpoints, mounds of earth, and barbed wire. The fenced entrance gives only one access point in or out. GHF workers drop the pallets and the boxes of food and open the fences, allowing thousands in all at once to fight down to the last grain of rice. If people arrive early and approach the checkpoints, they get shot. If they arrive on time, but there is an overflow and they jump over the mounds and the wires, they get shot. If they arrive late, they shouldn't be there because it's an evacuated zone, so they get shot." According to the organization, the rate of people seeking treatment for gunshot wounds in the second week of GHF operations and the first week when the GHF was really operating at capacity were triple what they had been before the group took over aid distribution. Those people flow into a medical system with exceptionally poor facilities, tiny supplies of medicine and anesthetics, and doctors and nurses who are quite often malnourished themselves. For ordinary Gazans now faced with the impossible choice of traveling to aid centers anyway or starving to death someplace else, the practical effects of the killings have been devastating. Thousands of families have been forced to relocate to the barren, infrastructurally devoid areas near food distribution sites in very crowded conditions with little to no sanitation capacity or means to distribute clean water, fuel, or medical supplies. There, those with the strength to wait in lines all day for GHF sites to open up have no choice but to do so, while people who are too hungry or weak to be physically capable of fighting for a spot in line, the food that people do often receive is meager, difficult or impossible to eat in its intended form without water and cooking fuel for preparation, in a place where water and cooking fuel are just not available. That food is at high risk of being stolen, leading to violent confrontations between civilians. By the 1st of July, over 200 major humanitarian groups were calling for the GHF to be immediately dismantled, including Doctors Without Borders, Oxfam International, Save the Children, and the International Federation for Human Rights. At this point, however, it should be no surprise, given Israel and the GHF's prior contact, that those demands have been ignored. All the while, the GHF has proudly defended its work, claiming in late June that it had delivered over 52 million meals after 5 weeks of operations, in contrast to other humanitarian groups who, quote, stand by helplessly as their aid is looted. The GHF has routinely pointed to its stated offers to other humanitarian groups to receive their food supplies and deliver those supplies to the GHF's checkpoints in a manner that the GHF claims is safe. As one spokesperson for the group insisted to the global press, and we'll quote them here, the humanitarian community must return to its core mission, feeding people, not providing outdated systems or avoiding the discomfort of change. Quite frankly, it would be grossly irresponsible for us here at WarFronts to fail to point out that GHF's claims do not match reality, and that the organization's distribution process has turned out to be far more deadly, far more inefficient, and far more of a free-for-all between starving civilians than anything that the international aid community had done previously. To be clear, there were plenty of problems with the ways that aid had been distributed in Gaza before the GHF took over, but in practice, the GHF hasn't addressed any of those concerns. Instead, the organization appears to have given itself license to give up on the idea of reasonably safe, reasonably efficient aid distribution, and then completely abdicated responsibility for the results of the system that it has created. So, who is responsible? With all this chaos and carnage and so many competing explanations on how and why things have gotten this bad, who should the international community believe? Has the IDF simply rid itself of any lingering sense of obligation not to fire into crowds? Has Hamas taken advantage of the situation, inflamed it, and misrepresented the truth of things on the ground? Are foreign contractors responsible, or other militant terror groups, or somebody else entirely? As one might expect in a situation like this, the answer is complicated, and other than the unarmed, starving civilians caught literally in the crossfire, very few groups are entirely blameless. And we'll start with Hamas, who certainly have done their best to manipulate the situation and serve their own broader goals. In mid-June, Hamas was accused of attacking a bus filled with Palestinian aid workers, helping the GHF, killing 8 of them and injuring over 20. On the same day, they claimed credit for the killing of 12 militants from a group called the Popular Forces, an anti-Hamas militia that's currently being backed by Israel, but is alleged to have its own troubling links to the Islamic State, according to some of Israel's own prominent opposition leaders. On the 5th of July, Hamas members reportedly threw a pair of grenades at American aid workers, injuring them in the process. Israel has levied accusations that Hamas has been more active than that short list of incidents would suggest. After the 1st of June killings in Rafah, Israel released drone footage depicting armed, masked men shooting at civilians in what it claimed was an attack by Hamas agitators that same day in the city of Khan Yunis. The GHF blamed a crowd crush on Hamas as well when it killed several people on July the 16th, in the only deadly incident at an aid distribution site that the GHF has acknowledged so far. Additionally, Israel has accused Hamas of manipulating the media environment around those incidents, inflating death tolls, spreading rumors of shootings that Israel denies, and otherwise misrepresenting a situation that Israel and the GHF claim to be far more orderly and restrained than what's currently being reported. But although Hamas remains an agitating actor in this situation, little, if any, credible evidence has emerged from the vast majority of attack sites that would implicate Hamas either for killing civilians or engineering a situation in which the IDF or security forces attacked when they otherwise would not have. Instead, Hamas's involvement right now appears to be largely opportunistic, making the most of a situation that can be conveniently twisted or represented in a way that Hamas could use to gin up sympathy. Quite frankly, it's impossible to explain the current state of affairs at GHF aid sites given currently available information simply by blaming Hamas as an instigator of the violence. And without a doubt, claims that Hamas is simply fabricating false allegations of the killings just don't hold water. Hamas does not have the means to place dozens of dead in the hands of international medical responders, get all the wounded to report the same detailed version of events, and repeat that process literally dozens of times without being found out almost immediately, given the IDF's direct control over so much of Gaza. That's especially true for territory where Hamas would need time and consistent contact with the civilian population to orchestrate such a massive charade. Of all the things that could be going on here, that ain't one of them. And then we can turn to non-state armed groups at these aid sites. Security contractors charged with keeping order, and Israel-backed groups like the Popular Forces, who we mentioned before. When it comes to the security contractors, some have gone anonymously to news outlets and shared exceedingly troubling allegations, including one who spoke out to the BBC in an article published in early July and claimed that, quoting the article, a guard had opened fire from a watchtower with a machine gun because a group of women, children, and elderly people were moving too slowly away from the site. As that happened, another contractor on location, standing at the berm looking over the exit, opened up with 15 to 20 shots of repetitive weapons fire at the crowd. Now, that particular ex-contractor, who claimed to have worked at all 4 sites, said that he was told by a team leader, quote, "If you feel threatened, shoot. Shoot to kill and ask questions later." He additionally claimed that multiple team leaders had referred to the Gazan civilians as, quote, "zombie hordes." The GHF forcefully denied those particular allegations, just as they denied another set of allegations from the Associated Press in early July, drawing on interviews with a pair of contractors who described their colleagues as, quoting the article, often unqualified, unvetted, heavily armed, and seeming to have an open license to do whatever they wished. Those contractors alleged that their colleagues routinely used bullets, pepper spray, and stun grenades against civilians, as confirmed by videos that the contractors provided. According to Safe Reach Solutions, the contractor responsible for third-party security at GHF sites, there have been, quoting the AP, no serious injuries at any of their sites to date. As for the Israeli-backed Popular Forces, while a growing chorus of international media sources allege that the group and its leader Yasser Abu Shabab have considerable logistical ties to the Islamic State and recruit ex-members, the group doesn't appear to be directly involved in attacks at or around GHF aid sites. Then let's talk about the GHF itself, because if the claim by Safe Reach Solutions that nobody had been seriously injured at aid sites seemed a little bit dubious, then the claims made by the GHF directly are stunning. And let's be very clear about this. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation actively denies the claim that there have been any mass casualty events at its sites except a single acknowledged crowd crush incident on July the 16th, for which the GHF blames Hamas. As we've already said, we certainly wouldn't advise taking Hamas-run civil organizations like the Gaza Health Ministry at their word when it comes to casualty counts, but to outright deny that the IDF or security contractors have perpetrated any killings of Palestinians is simply ludicrous at this stage. As for whether the GHF is actively responsible for the killings, it is important to emphasize that GHF personnel do not appear to be the people holding guns, pointing them at civilians, and opening fire. But there are real questions to be asked about the extent to which the GHF, drawn up by Israel and seemingly financially supported mostly by Israeli actors, operates in coordination with the IDF. Certainly, the GHF's decisions to create so few distribution points and to leave aid unattended and without proper screening in fortified boxes with one path of ingress and egress set the conditions for large numbers of desperate people to push into areas from which they cannot easily escape. Whether that is an intentional choice or an unintended knock-on effect of decisions that were made for other reasons is difficult to say. But quite frankly, it's difficult not to assume the worst from an organization that still refuses to admit that mass casualty shooting incidents have even taken place. And finally, we come to the people standing behind the guns. That, of course, is the IDF, and in a broader sense, the Israeli government. In late June, an article by the Israeli outlet Haaretz seemed to confirm the worst fears of global observers, claiming that IDF soldiers were ordered explicitly to open fire on civilian crowds. Anonymous soldiers and officers interviewed for the report explained that the IDF essentially treated Palestinian civilians as an incoming wave of hostiles and directed soldiers to use heavy machine gun and mortar fire to get them away from GHF distribution sites, shooting into the crowd even if Israeli soldiers on the ground had no perception that they or their fellow soldiers were in danger. According to the soldiers interviewed in the report, firing continued despite the fact that there have been no instances of Palestinians returning fire while being shot at. The report was dismissed and forcefully condemned by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense minister, who attacked it as, quote, bloody libel, while the IDF maintained that it had never issued those sorts of orders and was investigating cases of potential wrongdoing. The Haaretz report indicated that Israel's military advocate general had pushed for an investigation of war crimes stemming from the GHF aid site incidents, although that investigation is not currently known to have been approved. As for what the justification could be within the IDF for firing on civilians, it can't yet be ruled out that the GHF's operations are a way to intentionally concentrate Palestinians within range of identification and screening tools. There, the IDF could be working to find people who might be affiliated with armed groups, taking advantage of their appearance when they try to collect food. In fact, a large part of the early premise behind the GHF was that food would only be handed out to people who had been screened and were found not to be a part of Hamas or other armed groups. But according to recent reporting, the GHF isn't directly collecting that information themselves. A recent CNN report alleges that several eyewitnesses have testified that they haven't been identified, screened, or security checked before entering GHF sites, and those same eyewitnesses claim that organized criminals and illegal aid merchants have capitalized on the lax security. Video produced by CNN shows young men loading and taking away aid boxes on donkey-drawn carts. Granted, that doesn't mean the IDF isn't using its own means of screening aid recipients, perhaps by remote facial identification or other biometric systems, and in fact, there is a legitimate tactical argument for allowing GHF security to be lax if those other measures were in place. After all, if groups like Hamas believe they aren't being monitored, they might take the risk of going to GHF sites, being identified, and then tracked and hunted down after the fact. If that's the case, then it could be that the IDF is targeting known or suspected militants hidden within these crowds and accepting mass civilian casualties in order to ensure that they eliminate known enemy combatants. Recent reporting by the New York Times in a long article on Benjamin Netanyahu's alleged efforts to stay in power by prolonging the war in Gaza indicates that the IDF has, in the past, adjusted its metric for acceptable civilian casualties. Quoting their report, which discusses the actions undertaken shortly after the October 7th attacks, quote, "Shortly afterward, the generals significantly loosened their rules of engagement, expanding the set of military targets that their subordinates could hit in preemptive airstrikes, while exponentially increasing, sometimes by a factor of 20, the number of civilians that officers could endanger in each attack." If, in this case, the IDF has taken a similar approach, allowing its troops on the ground to endanger large groups of civilians in order to eliminate militants identified by their screening processes, then the killing of a dozen or 24 civilians to get at 1 or 2 militants would be in line with what the Times report describes. In any case, when discussing mass casualty incidents like this, it should generally be expected that the person or people most directly responsible are the ones shooting the guns at innocent civilians, and here that certainly seems to be the case. How much of this violence is coming on orders from Israeli leadership? That's an open question, as are the ultimate objectives that they're trying to achieve. But at the very least, we can say that the IDF is routinely carrying out these mass casualty incidents at a scale and frequency that would suggest that Israeli leadership is at least allowing it to continue. Just as important, it appears that the GHF, despite the denial of any fatal incidents other than the crowd crush accidents, are creating the conditions for these massacres to take place. Now, at the time that this episode was written, mass casualty confrontations at GHF aid sites are still ongoing, but a series of early indicators would suggest that a change in Israeli policy could be on the horizon. Bearing that in mind, the question at hand now is just how much Israel is willing to change, how long they'll allow adjustments to carry on before reverting to their current course, and whether they'll actually be effective or reduced to a simple token effort by Jerusalem before being dismissed as failures. International pressure has been mounting on Israel to relent as more and more images and accounts of widespread severe malnutrition filter through the global press. In the United States, the country that sends Israel more military and humanitarian support than any other, Democrats in Congress have pushed hard for greater accountability on the GHF's part. Those efforts, however, have been largely unsuccessful, done by a minority party in a government where Republicans have been entirely unwilling to allow the GHF to face any scrutiny. On July the 21st, a group of 28 Western nations took a stand together led by France, Canada, Britain, Italy, and Australia, condemning the, quote, drip feeding of aid and the inhumane killing of civilians, including children, seeking to meet their most basic needs of water and food. They're also demanding an end to the war. As to whether that call had an effect, it was dismissed by Israel's foreign ministry as being, quote, disconnected from reality. An official statement read that it, quote, fails to focus the pressure on Hamas and fails to recognize Hamas's role and responsibility for the situation. Most recently, again at the time of writing, Paris announced that France will formally recognize Palestine as a state at the UN General Assembly this September, and it appears that London may follow suit. While this would be a largely symbolic move, France and Britain would be two of the most powerful among some 140 countries that currently recognize a Palestinian state, and it would come as a major rhetorical blow to the Netanyahu government from a country in France with the largest Jewish population in Europe and the largest Muslim population in Western Europe. Of course, it should be no surprise that the announcement prompted intense backlash from Netanyahu and from the United States, but we can quite literally guarantee that the Macron government knew what was coming. In exchange for European endorsement of Palestinian statehood, the Macron government has indicated that Arab nations, including Saudi Arabia, will issue condemnations of Hamas and call for its disarmament for the very first time. According to France's foreign minister, not just Britain but Germany would consider following France and recognizing Palestine under these conditions. Just as important as the mounting political pressure comes new evidence undercutting Israel's justification for its reliance on the GHF. According to exclusive reporting by Reuters, an internal analysis within the US government, particularly by the remnants of the US aid organization, found in late June that there was no evidence of systemic theft of humanitarian aid by Hamas. According to Reuters, that analysis catalogued 156 incidents in which US-funded aid had been stolen or lost between October 2023 and May 2025, and found no indication that Hamas benefited at large scale from having stolen or otherwise obtained that aid. In fact, it found that over a quarter of those incidents were attributable to the actions of the Israeli military rather than Hamas. The Reuters report was disputed by the US State Department, but it indicates that even analysis by Israel's most important backer has undercut the premise that Israel has used to justify the GHF's existence. To be clear, Israel has never actually produced conclusive evidence to support its claims of systemic aid theft by Hamas, despite claiming regularly that it does have evidence to that effect. After that article came out, the New York Times issued an even more damning report to back it up, stating that according to two senior Israeli military officials, even the IDF itself has never found proof of systemic aid theft by Hamas. Those officials, as well as a pair of other Israeli sources in the know, told the Times that the UN's aid delivery systems have actually been quite effective overall. As pressure mounts on Israel to change its course of action, the situation for ordinary Palestinians has grown even more dire. According to the World Food Programme, almost a third of Gaza's population is now not eating anything for consecutive days in a row, an even more sobering statistic in a place where, for months, many people have been trying to survive on scavenged items that most of the world would regard as inedible. On average, aid groups estimate that the food now being distributed in Gaza amounts to just 28 trucks of aid per day, less than 6% of the required 500 trucks per day that would be required to actually meet demand. The number of people dying from malnutrition has been gradually ticking upward in recent weeks, and after months in which parts of Gaza had approached and then been pulled back from the brink of famine again and again, humanitarian groups are insisting that the situation simply cannot hold for that much longer. More recently, over 100 aid groups signed on to yet another condemnation of Israel's aid restrictions, calling for those restrictions to be lifted so that proven competent aid groups can resume their work. According to Israel, however, those condemnations just serve Hamas and elevate Hamas's talking points against the government in Jerusalem. Quoting the foreign minister on social media here, "These organizations are serving the propaganda of Hamas, using their numbers, justifying their horrors instead of challenging the terror organization." As Israel frames the situation, these organizations are more than capable of distributing the thousands of aid trucks worth of food that are already in the area if only they'd agree to work within the GHF's new system. Said another government spokesman, quote, "In Gaza today, there is no famine caused by Israel. There is, however, a man-made shortage engineered by Hamas." But for international humanitarian foundations to essentially throw their endorsement behind a system that now bears responsibility for over 1,000 deaths of Palestinian civilians in just the last 2 months would be unthinkable. It's an impossible situation for those groups who have the aid available, even as their colleagues send back urgent reports of children wasting away and dying in their parents' arms. Those organizations have no reason to trust that the GHF would distribute that aid peacefully and in a responsible fashion when mass casualty incidents still happen every day. At the time of writing, however, it appears that Jerusalem is recognizing that stubborn refusal to change won't yield positive results. On Sunday, July the 27th, Israel allowed the United Arab Emirates and Jordan to parachute a combined 25 tons of aid into the Gaza Strip in the first such parachute operation in several months. Jordan and the UAE are the only nations as of now to have been cleared for aerial operations over Gaza. But although parachute drops represent at least some movement toward a resumption of humanitarian aid, they aren't enough to make much difference. 25 tons of aid is the equivalent of just a handful of aid trucks driving across the border, and the practice of parachute dropping aid comes with a laundry list of concerns, not least that people will be harmed by falling aid, or that aid could be captured by Hamas in the way that Israel has claimed UN aid is siphoned away. There are limits to the amount of aid that can be airdropped on a short timeline, and if this first day's haul of 25 tons is any indication, then deliveries will fall well short of what is needed in Gaza. Nor are Jordan or the Emirates particularly good candidates for this kind of operation. The Emirates have only about a dozen suitable tactical or strategic airlifters at their disposal, while Jordan has even fewer. The most promising sign of real change came on the very day that this episode was written, as July the 27th, when the IDF announced a 10-hour-long halt of its military operations in Gaza. On the 27th, that pause was meant to coincide with the drop of Jordanian and Emirati aid, but according to Israeli officials, those stops will now happen daily in several areas. The IDF is also establishing secure routes for convoys to bring food and medicine into Gaza from 6 in the morning to 11 at night. According to Israel, those shipments will include deliveries from the United Nations in what the chief of aid for the UN, Tom Fletcher, described to the international press as a one-week window to drastically scale up aid deliveries. Fletcher indicated that up to 100 truckloads of aid could move into Gaza, which they will have done by the time this episode is aired. At the time of writing, there are still many important details that have yet to be revealed to the public, but by the time this episode is released, we hope that global headlines will show that food and medicine really is being surged into Gaza by legitimate humanitarian groups. Nevertheless, the outcome that international advocacy groups want most of all, a ceasefire to end the war and start a more permanent surge of humanitarian aid, appears no closer today than it's ever been. On the 24th of July, the United States announced that it was withdrawing from the latest round of ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas in Qatar, with Special Envoy Steve Witkoff accusing Hamas of a, quote, lack of desire to reach a ceasefire. Said Witkoff, quoting again, while the mediators have made a great effort, Hamas does not appear to be coordinated or acting in good faith. We will now consider alternative options to bring the hostages home and try to create a more stable environment for the people of Gaza. Israel confirmed that it, too, had withdrawn its negotiators from the talks after Hamas issued its response to a ceasefire proposal that Israel and the US had put forward. The nature of the, quote, alternative options that Israel and the US will pursue is currently unknown, but the options could be anything from a renewed campaign of airstrikes to an expanded ground invasion to the start of implementation of a plan that would see Gaza entirely depopulated and its people resettled to third nations against their will. Said US President Donald Trump on Friday the 25th, quote, I think they want to die, and it's very bad. And it's got to be to a point where you're going to have to finish the job. Despite the international backlash, despite the intense outcry by humanitarian organizations, the reality of Gaza's situation is quite simple. Until and unless Israel decides to drastically overhaul its approach to aid distribution, the situation will not change. A drip feeding of aid through a single week of ground deliveries and intermittent airdrops will not be enough. It's Israel, backed by the United States, that chooses how aid is distributed in Gaza, when and where it's distributed, and how many people are going to die while aid distribution takes place. This, the current state of affairs in the Gaza Strip, is what Israel has chosen, and no matter how forceful the denials from Jerusalem or the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the overwhelming evidence shows that over 1,000 Gazan civilians have been killed. The situation now is untenable, and it is impossible to say for sure what might happen if things continue to evolve on their current course. But unless something changes fast, this situation will find ways to keep on getting worse, and it'll be the civilian population of Gaza that pays the price. Thank you for watching.